Thank you, Mr. President. I am grateful to General Secretary Miroslava Jench for the detailed report on the situation in the gas sector and the situation around the hostages who remain in the enclave. I would like to note the presence of Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar among us. We listened attentively to Elia David and got acquainted with the letter from the Israeli side. We mourn all the innocent victims of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, regardless of their citizenship and nationality. We, like everyone present here, were shocked by the footage published at the beginning of the month with two Israeli hostages, Roma Braslavsky and Yator David. Judging by the footage, they look depressed, extremely exhausted and weak due to the acute shortage of food and water, which, as we know, all gas residents face. Every day spent as hostages in the gas sector is a tragedy for themselves and their loved ones, who are waiting for their return every minute. We also listened attentively to the recent statements of Roma Braslavsky, Yator David, and other Israeli hostages. We share their pain, but we cannot help but note that the words of some people, who are in an extremely difficult emotional state and are worried about the fate of their children, are directly critical of the country's leadership, which, according to some of them, by delaying the negotiation process with Hamas, is thus signing a death sentence for the hostages. I would like to remind you that we immediately condemned the tragic events of October 7, 2023, which cannot be justified, as it cannot be justified the collective punishment of the gas residents and the transformation of the entire region into a zone of total despair. We have spoken and continue to speak for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages and the immediate cessation of the fire in the gas sector. Mr. President, I am sincerely convinced that there will be no delegation in this room that would dispute the simple fact that the life of every person is important and priceless. We should not choose whose pain is more worthy of attention. This applies to both the Israelis and the peaceful Palestinians who have been living for almost 670 days under the daily bombardment of Israel. At a time when the whole world was watching with a trembling heart the horrific footage with Roma Braslavsky and Yator David, shocking data about the deaths of over 180 people in the period from August 1 to 2 followed from the gas. We learn about such tragedies almost every day. In total, since October 2023, more than 61,000 Palestinians have died, among whom, according to UNICEF, more than 18,000 children. Against this background, the general situation in Gaza cannot be characterized otherwise than a humanitarian catastrophe, which has consequences not only for the Gaza Strip, but also for the Israeli hostages. The Palestinians themselves die in the enclave not only as a result of air bombs and artillery shells, but also due to the widespread starvation and outbreaks of various diseases. According to the UN World Food Programme, every third Palestinian starves for several days. The terrible statistics of victims of hostilities and lack of food are supplemented by the dead and wounded in queues for food in the places of operation of the so-called Humanitarian Fund for Gaza. The figure is 1,000. Since May 27th, almost 500 Palestinians have been killed. The consequences of the practice of dropping pallets with food aid from the air have also caused serious concern. Just yesterday, humanitarian bombs crushed 2 medical personnel at Al-Aqsa Hospital in Deir el-Balahi to death. General Commissar Bapur, Mr. Lazarin, in his last comments, warned against further use of such a very dangerous and, in addition, costly scheme of delivery of aid, which costs 100 times more than land routes. At the same time, there are more than 6,000 trucks with food supplies around the sector, which would be enough for several months for the well-off civilian population. Mr. Chairman, we are shocked by the targeted attack on the headquarters of the Palestinian community of the Red Crescent in Khan Yunis, as a result of which several employees were killed and several people were injured. This, unfortunately, is not the first case of killing members of the community of the Red Crescent in Gaza. We all remember how the Israeli military mercilessly shot the employees of the ambulance of this organization, the bodies of which were found in March in a brother's grave. We call on Israel to stop this arbitrariness. Humanitarian and medical workers should not become targets, as well as the building of the headquarters of the Palestinian community of the Red Crescent, which is marked with the corresponding emblem and is unambiguously under the protection of international humanitarian law. Contrary to the statements of Western Jerusalem, the humanitarian blockade of enclave, which was introduced by them in March, is essentially preserved to this day. Since July 27, partial weakening and limited supplies have been announced as part of the so-called tactical pauses. According to the recognition of the UN humanitarian structures, only a drop in the ocean against the background of acute needs of the Gazans, including, as we all understand, the needs of the Israeli hostages. In this context, we fully support the calls of the Baypor leadership and other UN agencies to immediately eliminate the obstacle to the delivery of everything necessary to Gaza, including food, water, fuel, and medicines. We are extremely concerned by the aggressive campaign launched by Western Jerusalem against the employees of the KGV of the UN and its head, Tom Fletcher, which gives a sober and not always pleasant assessment of the situation in enclave. We see that the UN humanitarians are really trying to analyze it in a complex way and find a way to somehow improve the dire situation of the Palestinians. The undisputed truth remains that in order to establish uninterrupted and unhindered supplies of humanitarian aid, the main thing is to create the necessary and safe conditions. Unfortunately, regular calls to ceasefire, sounding from both the UN Secretary-General and the overwhelming majority of the world community, remain without proper response from the Israeli leadership. In Western Jerusalem, any means and under any pretext are still set to wage a war in Gaza. They are trying to avoid a military operation in the sector. Mr. Chairman, no less concern is caused by the course chosen by the Israeli authorities to clean up and colonize the western bank of the Jordan River. The ordinary Palestinians and even foreigners become victims of the never-ending raids of security forces and the violence of the settlers. Thus, on July 30th, an official vehicle of the Russian government under the Palestinian administration was attacked. Moreover, this happened while the Israeli soldiers were being let in. In addition, new anti-records of destruction and expropriation of the property of the local residents, the construction of new settlements, and the legalization of outposts are being established in order to cut off the main Palestinian cities from each other. Knesset continues to adopt new provocative resolutions. Following last year's decisions to ban Baypor at the end of July, a no less dangerous decision was made to distribute the sovereignty of Israel to the western bank of the Jordan River. It is obvious that the uniform line of knowledge of the Palestinians, whether from the Gaza sector or the western bank of the Jordan River, is fraught with new risks for the stability and security of the Middle East, and is able to once again put the region on the brink of a great war. It is also obvious that the complete freedom of the hands of the Israelis for any actions in Gaza and on the western bank of the Jordan River would not have been possible without direct military support and the international political coverage of the United States. At the same time, the vast majority of countries in the world reject this line. The American-Israeli boycott of the high-level international conference in support of the two-state solution, which took place on July 28-30, became indicative in this regard. In addition, Washington's attempts to discourage its partners from participating in this forum have been in vain. Certain optimism suggests that, despite the open pressure of the Americans, the majority of members of the international community were not afraid and showed solidarity with the Palestinian people, and some Western capitals, albeit with great delay, announced plans to recognize the state of Palestine as early as next month. Mr. Chairman, despite the severity of the current situation, we are still convinced that the diplomatic settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was and remains the only viable solution. We urge the parties to return to the negotiating table in support of the mediators in order to develop mutually acceptable solutions to restore the ceasefire regime, free the detained persons, and unblock the humanitarian access to the Gaza Strip. We are confident that this is what the residents of Palestine and its hostages, including those close to the Gaza Strip, will do. We hope that all regional and international participants will work in this direction. The negotiation process should be returned to the political course, which would allow us to take into account both the legal interests of Israel in the sphere of security and the Palestinian people's right to gain their own state within the 1967 borders. Thank you for your attention. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. President. We heard the heartbreaking testimony of Eli, brother of the hostage Eviatar David, starved by Hamas. I want to thank the US and other countries for answering our call. Thank you for convening this urgent and important meeting of the UN Security Council. But we also heard here so many lies. I cannot refer to them all, but it was really funny to hear Russian Federation representative, after 3 years and a half of a brutal invasion and brutal war in Ukraine and bombardments on civilian population in Kiev and other places, speaking here the way he spoke. I also heard the Palestinian representative. I must say the Palestinians learned propaganda from you, from the Soviet era, and you were good teachers. The Palestinians invented terrorism as a way to promote their means, and it includes all Palestinian fractions. And until this very day, the Palestinian Authority continued to pay salaries to terrorists and terrorist families accordingly to the crime the terrorists committed. And this is how they encourage terrorism until this very day. You spoke about peace. From 1947, you had countless opportunities to reach peace. You rejected them all. I come here today as the Foreign Minister of the State of Israel, the sovereign state of the Jewish people, fighting for its existence for almost 2 years on 7 different fronts. I'm here today because our hostages are still there, starved, tortured by Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the dungeons of Gaza. on October 7th, Hamas invaded, with no reason, into Israel. It committed evil crimes like the Nazis and ISIS did. They murdered and raped women, killed children in front of their parents, and parents in front of their children. They beheaded people, burned whole families alive, took 251 hostages into cruel captivity. 50 of them are still there, starved and tortured. I want to read from the Dina Project report. This report describes Hamas' sickening sexual crimes and atrocities committed on October 7th. And since then, bodies were found with objects inserted into their private parts. Bodies of naked women were found cuffed onto trees. Bodies were found with signs of genital mutilation. Most of the sexually assaulted women were among the 1,166 murdered of that day. After they were raped, they were murdered. They are forever silenced. But sexual violence continued for those taken in captivity. Amit Susana was released from Hamas' cruel captivity. She described bravely how she was forced at gunpoint to commit a sexual act on her capture. This is the pure evil that Israel faces. Hamas crimes are still ongoing. This past weekend, the whole world witnessed the cruel starvation of Eviatar David and Ron Braslavsky, tortured at the hands of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. The world saw their terrible condition, bones standing out in their skin like living skeletons, looking death in their eye. Eviatar was forced to dig his own grave. You just heard his brother, Eli. Hamas and Islamic Jihad used the starvation and torture of hostages as evil tools. It's part of a deliberate and well-planned sadistic propaganda campaign. Its goals: 1, psychological terror. 2nd, an attempt to create a link between our starved hostages and their blood libel against Israel. But it's a campaign of lies. Israel facilitated huge amounts of aid into Gaza since the beginning of the war. In an unprecedented way in the history of wars. And by the way, the quantities are growing every day, if you follow that. Yet it is still accused of starvation. But the truth must be told. Hamas sadistically starves our hostages while the terrorists enjoy meat, fish, and vegetables. And we saw the brother of Eviatar demonstrated that with the photo of the well-fed terrorist with Eviatar in his terrible condition. And you all saw the thick, meaty arm of the well-fed terrorist next to Eviatar, the living skeleton forced to dig his own grave. We facilitating huge amounts of aid into Gaza. No other country acts this way in war, on such a large scale, under such difficult circumstances. But Hamas loots the aid and uses it as a financial tool. We hadn't heard a word about that from the Palestinian representative. The distorted Hamas terrorists cruelly decide if and what the hostages will eat, mainly what they will not eat. Eviatar spoke of entire days when he did not eat at all. Our sick and starved hostages still have not seen representatives of the Red Cross until today. despite this being explicitly agreed upon in the hostage deal in November 2023. The medicine they desperately need to survive has not reached them. While the terrorists, the murderers being held in Israeli prisons, received medical care and nutrition, Hamas and Islamic Jihad torture our hostages. Terror states and organizations kidnapping civilians is not just our problem. But Hamas did it on a huge scale on October 7th. These terror states and organizations do so in order to ensure their own survival and interests. Terrorists inhumanely kidnap innocent civilians as tools to achieve their goals. In the case of Hamas, they try to force upon us their conditions remaining in power in Gaza. And don't illude yourself. They don't care that someone else will take responsibility on civilian issues, taking care of the ruins they left behind in Gaza. They want to stay the strongest military force to continue their war against Israel and its civilians. This dangerous phenomenon could happen tomorrow anywhere in the world. The world must put an end to the kidnapping of civilians. The international community must take it not worthwhile for the terrorists. Today it's Israel, tomorrow it's you. The world has been turned upside down. While Hamas ran its propaganda machine, a huge part of the international media is both ignoring the truth and buying its lies. I read the New York Times the day after Hamas released the distorted video of Eviatar David. I looked, but could not find Eviatar on the front page. And then I couldn't find his picture in all of the paper. I call on the international media. Put Eviatar and Rome front and center. Is this not newsworthy? We are witnessing an upside-down world. We are witnessing the twisted anti-Israeli agenda of so much of the global media. They shift the responsibility from the kidnappers and rapists to the attacked country. They shift the blame from terrorists to the victims. Instead of standing by Israel, you are blaming the victims of an attack from 7 different fronts. And I ask here at the United Nations Security Council, do you know what Secretary General Guterres tweeted after the horrible images of Eviatar and Rome were released? Not a word. Deafening silence. Yet we all see his endless and obsessive tweets against Israel, time and again. Ladies and gentlemen, what we are witnessing today is the rise of psychotic anti-Semitism around the world, flamed by modern blood libels like darkest days in history. Jews are hunted around the world simply because they are Jews. In Melbourne, in Amsterdam, in Paris. But it is not the only war on earth, but it's the only case. People are being hunted everywhere because of their nationality. Do you know of another nation fighting for its life and suffering around the world from hostility and violence? We are living in an upside-down world, a world in which Israel is put on a bench of the accused while it fights for its survival. There is a name for it. It's called anti-Semitism. 80 years after the end of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism is having its golden age once again. There are countries that acted, even in this building, to pressure Israel instead of Hamas during sensitive days in the negotiations. They directly contributed to the assassination of the chances to reach a hostage deal and ceasefire. They prolonged this war. This is what they did. So now let us ask the simplest questions. Who initiated the war on October 7th? Who is responsible for its continuation, for the endless suffering? There is only one clear answer: Hamas. Hamas invaded Israel and committed the October 7 atrocities. Hamas still refuses to release the starving hostages from its dungeons. Hamas still refuses to lay down its arms. The call on Hamas to release our hostages must be front and center on the world stage. It must not stop until they are all come home. Mr. President, we call for the immediate and unconditional release of our hostages. We call on the UN Security Council to finally condemn Hamas for its evil crimes, to hold it responsible, and to demand the immediate release of all our hostages. Thank you.